And you know, one of the things you learn when you're trying to teach something is just bloody well how little you know about it. And so I started to dig more deeply into the history of the Balfour Declaration, although I knew Salim was going to cover it. And you know, I could give a pretty credible 20-minute presentation on the history of the Balfour Declaration, but it didn't sit well with me because it isn't the right thing for me to be talking about. It's not my area of expertise. And to say anything about the political situation, like anything definitive, it's like, that just seemed like absolute hubris. You know, I mean, there's so much going on in that little corner of the world that for me to take a position of solution on it just seemed absurd. And I thought, okay, well, I'm no historian and I don't have any answers, so what in the world, where in the world does that leave me? Then I thought, well, I remembered something that Hans Eyck, who's a very famous psychologist, said about the complexity of the world, let's say, and that formulating the damn problem is often a really good step to solving it. And I thought, well, I can certainly see where the problems are, and maybe I can see them from a psychological perspective. And so what I ended up doing was listing a bunch of problems. And so I'm going to talk to you about why. You see, it was kind of interesting today how this laid itself out, because Salim provided some history, and then Ezra talked personally and historically, but he also talked psychologically. You know, one of the questions that he raised, not explicitly, precisely, but implicitly, but evidently, was like, who cares? Why is this so important? Why is this little ratty part of the world that's like just scraped out of useless desert, fundamentally? Why in the world is everyone obsessed with it? You know, and it's really something. It's always struck me. And so I thought, well, maybe that was something a psychologist could talk about.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that struck me when Ezra was speaking is that, you know, maybe even the enemies of the Jews perversely respect them because they've done so well in the Middle East that it's just annoying.
That's true.
You don't want to be thinking that success is necessarily going to attract admiration, right? I mean, we know from the Cain and Abel story that success can attract murderous resentment and the desire to destroy. And so that's just one of the problems, I think, is that in some ways Israel is a shining beacon on the hill. And of course, in some ways, I suppose it's not. But at least in part it is, and that's something, especially in that God-forsaken part of the world. So where there's very little sign of anything resembling the city of God. And then I thought, well, let's think about Israel, and it's a small place, and the conflicts are small scale, but vital. And I was thinking today about the fact that the geographical area is small, but the psychological or spiritual area is very large, right? I mean, because Israel happens to have Jerusalem in the middle of it, which I suppose is quite amazing, but also very problematic, because Jerusalem is regarded as a holy city by all three, roughly, Western religions. And the idea of the holy city is a really interesting idea. You know, it's half geographical and half psychological. It's more psychological, from my perspective, than geographical. I suppose that's probably because well, we won't get into that, but it's more psychological than it is geographical from my perspective. But the idea of the holy city is really worth thinking about, because I think it's part of the reason that this part of the world compels so much attention, because all three Western religions have a vision, you know, and they differ in their vision, but there's some shared elements. Like, one of the shared elements is that there is such a thing as a holy city. And what's a holy city? It's a very old idea. I mean, it's a tremendously old idea. It's something like, for human beings, it's like the sanctity of the community itself, you know, because the community is a place that's predicated on the ultimate value, and then it's walled in, and then it's surrounded by chaos and barbarism, essentially. And it's home, it's the ideal, it's the proper polity, it's the ideal state, it's the hope for the future. That's also what it is. And it's the utopia, it's heaven on earth, it's paradise, it's Eden reestablished, it's the place where all suffering disappears, right? It's the vision of humanity. And all three major Western religions agree that such a place exists and that it actually happens to exist in Jerusalem and that it's actually real. And, that's actually a remarkable degree of agreement, especially about something that's so metaphysical and strange and also so ancient. Well, it's interesting that we've come to agreement about that, although it's certainly the case that we haven't come to much agreement about exactly how the city of God should be ruled. And that's where the problems come, I suppose, because, as you all know, the devil, and in this case, probably literally so, is always in the details. And so I believe that Israel and Jerusalem is a microcosm of the human longing for the return of paradise, let's say that. And that we're all involved in a tremendous drama and watching it play itself out in this tiny corner of the world where Muslims and Jews and Christians are forced painfully and horribly to confront one another at the deepest level of reality. Well, so what are the problems? Well, one of them is that people lie all the time about exactly what's going on in Israel and why they're on one side or the other. They lie because they're malevolent, because they want destruction, because they're jealous, because they're anti-Semitic, because they're anti-Islamic, because they're anti-Christian, because they resent success. That's a big problem. Another problem is, well, all three religions make a group-oriented claim to rights to the territory, and then that raises a terrible specter, because it's the specter of group rights, right? Is that groups have the right to self-determination, and that groups can have a historical claim to a piece of geography. And of course that spins us into a terrible conflict between the idea of group identity and the idea of individual rights, and we have no idea how to sort that out. And then the problem of group identity and historical claims is magnified by the problem of time frame, and this is a major psychological problem, man. It's like, well, you think about, say, the common complaint that the Western colonialists say were responsible for the divisions of the Middle East. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. If you start history at 1917, after the Allies won the First World War and took down the Ottoman Empire, and in the aftermath of the collapse of the European monarchies, you could say, well, England and France had the upper hand and they arbitrarily divided up the Middle East, but you could just as easily say that, well, the damn empire had collapsed and they had to do something with it, and it wasn't obvious, and they gave some of it to the Arabs, who really didn't have any land to begin with, or not any independent land, that's for sure, because they were dominated by the Ottoman Empire, and they decided to give some of it to the Jews. And well, maybe that wasn't the world's best solution either way, but they were maybe making the best of a bad lot. I mean, that's certainly one way of thinking about it. And then, if you stretch your historical imagination back several thousand years, well, then you can say, well, the Jews have a historical claim to Palestine, let's say, and to Jerusalem. But the problem is, well, why take that particular frame of history? You can take any frame of history you want, and then the conclusions that you draw from the facts that you observe differ substantially. And that's a big psychological problem, because it's not easy to determine what the appropriate time frame is to analyze the significance of historical events, and no one knows how to deal with that problem. And so at least we could say it's a problem, because it clearly is. And it's part of the reason, I think, why Palestine and the conflict there just never leaves the Western imagination. That's another major cognitive problem, a cognitive historical problem in some sense that we don't know how to solve. We don't know how to solve the problem of proxies. It could be that the Israelis and the Palestinians would actually like peace, but it doesn't matter, because they're surrounded by people who can use them to, especially the Palestinians in my estimation, to continue to agitate for their extracurricular political motives. And if they have to sacrifice the Palestinians to do it, well, so much the better. That solves more than one problem at the same time. And so that is another indication of precisely why the problem is so absurdly complicated. There's another one too, which is the problem of group identity and the state as salvation. This is a deep problem. No one ever talks about this. This is actually, I would say, one of the places where Christianity and Judaism differ most intently. And maybe I'm wrong about this, and I probably am, because I'm wrong about lots of things. But You know, it seems to me that there's more emphasis in Judaism that the state is the locus of salvation than there is in Christianity, which seems to stress the individual as locus of salvation more precisely. Now, perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle, because people have a cultural identity and an individual identity, but I'm not trying to offer solutions because I can't. I'm trying to outline problems, as we don't know how. Like, you have a group identity, which is convenient for you to use whenever you need to use it, but it's kind of annoying for everyone when someone else's group identity starts to interfere with your individual rights. And like, we're in a terrible battle in Canada and across the Western world, for that matter, with regards to the relationship between group identity and individual rights. And so that's pinpointed tremendously in Israel, right? It's like laser focus there. Well, we don't know how to deal with that. So, and then the other thing is that you could view Israel as the nexus, the pinpoint, another pinpoint, where the first world and the third world come together and clash. You know, and Israel is essentially a first world country, and it's been heavily involved, it's been heavily allied with the West, let's put it that way, and extraordinarily successfully. And Israel has a tech industry that's just booming, you know. It's amazingly well-educated society and could offer a tremendous amount to the world in the upcoming years. And it's thriving in the midst of this third world chaos. And, well, do we know what to do about that? No. And are they thriving because they're exploiting everyone around them and exploiting everyone in the state? Because that's the new idea about the West, right? Is that the reason the West thrives is because we've stolen everything of value from all the people around the world who aren't thriving. And of course, there's enough truth in that so that it's difficult just to toss it out. But of course, it's an extraordinarily malevolent argument, and it ignores completely let's say, the economic value of a peaceful, law-abiding, and honest state, which I do believe, all things considered, we actually have managed to establish in the West, if you compare the West to everywhere else in the world, except for, you know, instead of some dubious, generally radical leftist utopia, you know, one execution away from utopia. That's the vision of the left. So, and then there's another problem. It's like, well, it's the problem of the victim versus the oppressor, right? And it's always victim versus oppressor. That's the thing that's so awful. And I see that from a psychological perspective too, because if you think of yourself as a victim, then you don't think of yourself as an oppressor. Well, then you've got it wrong, man, because you're victim and oppressor at the same time. But it's way easier to separate the world into the victims that I'm defending, you know, and hopefully don't have to be in the same category as, because that would be, you know, then I can have my cake and eat it too. And all those terrible oppressors out there that aren't me. And, you know, that's a psychological divide, because if you're such a fool that you think you're only victim and not oppressor, then there's so much you don't know about humanity and society that well, I don't even know what the proper metaphor for that is. You haven't even begun your journey to wisdom, let's put it that way. That would be the right way to think about it. And so, you know, the whole victim versus oppressor, the horrible victim versus oppressor mythology can be laid out again in the Israeli state, and then it depends on who you want to make victim and who you want to make oppressor. It's exactly the perfect situation for that, because you can look at the historical catastrophes that assaulted the Jewish people, which are absolutely undeniable, or you can take the side of the Palestinians. Take your choice. You can do your moral virtue signaling on both sides of the argument, and so that's extraordinarily convenient, especially if you don't have anything else to do. So, and that, you know, that ties into the problem of virtual signaling, because it's also very convenient for people who want to develop a sense of their own advanced morality to take on the problems of some distant state and wave their bloody banners and their protest signs in favor of the hypothesis and proposition that they're on the side of the moral right, when they can go home to their comfortable lives and never have to lift a finger in anything resembling real effort or put any real risk into it. And of course, that's what they're taught to do in the universities, because we don't have anything better to teach young people than that at the moment. So, you know, so what's the issue? Well, the issue is, why is that battle so absolutely fascinating? And the answer is because it contains a microcosm, at least, of the Western world. And I mean the broad Western world, right? Muslims, Jews, Christians, the whole messy, horrible shebang of it. And it puts it in front of us every single day, every single day. And the funny thing is we can't bloody well look away from it, right? Because there's something in all of us that's maybe aiming at the city of God, and we know that it's allied in some peculiar metaphysical sense with that dusty little country and the city of Jerusalem, you know, the holy city on the hill. And it calls at all of our consciences to be better people than we are, and to treat other people properly, and to live proper lives. And we're not doing that well enough, and you can tell, because there's plenty of catastrophe that remains in the city that's supposed to be holy to all three of the fundamental cultures that make up our civilization. So that's all I have to say about that.